All right, Suzanne, Joel, take it away.
Great, thanks so much. Thanks, Melanie, for that introduction. Joel, did you want me to start, or did you have any words? Okay. Well, thanks so much again, and thank you for allowing me the opportunity to welcome our participants to this webinar launch. While I can almost see everybody who's on this call. I'd really like to recognize from Southern Africa, the director of the Botswana Department of Wildlife and National Parks, Dr. Kabelo Senyatso, and the Kaza TFCA Secretariat, Dr. Nyambe Nyambe. And please allow me to say all protocol observed. I really wanted to take a moment to express my sincere appreciation to all of you in finding the time and the bandwidth, both literally and figuratively, to register for the first of 10 webinars we are supporting with the U.S. National Park Service regarding climate change adaptation on protected area management in Southern and Eastern Africa. This is actually part of our State Department's Embassy Science Fellows Program, which provides our embassies around the world access to the expertise of U.S. government officers in the science and technology fields. So in some way, it's like a matchmaking program. So thank you so much to the National Park Service for agreeing to help us and committing your time to bringing this series of seminars to our regions. We couldn't have done it without you. While it would be great, of course, to meet everyone in person, we hope this virtual series will provide accessible and useful information to all of you and your colleagues. So today we are very excited to be talking about climate change vulnerability assessments for protected areas. And how did we get here? Well, in just my first 6 months in Africa, I have heard and seen firsthand the challenges many of you are encountering in adapting your practices and your resources to the impact of climate change on your areas of responsibility. It's also quite timely to be having this kind of conversation in our regions following the COP26 summit in Glasgow, because now is the time to act on our pledges. As the United States, we have made a global commitment to reach net zero emissions and set the world on the right course. And because no country can solve the climate crisis alone, the United States is working with countries around the world and in Africa. We are all too aware that some of the things happening today threaten to erase the very progress that so many are struggling to advance. And as we know, Eastern and Southern Africa is home to many protected areas where some of the world's most iconic and endangered wildlife species reside. Climate change modeling shows that these areas are highly vulnerable to the effects of climate change, which we'll hear about today. And it's already resulting in changes in rainfall patterns that have contributed to desertification in some areas and reduced the availability of surface water and food sources for wildlife across the region. In addition, expanding and migrating human populations living near and sometimes within protected areas have further stressed ecosystems and sometimes resulted in human-wildlife conflict. But guess what? These trends are not unique to Africa. The protected areas in the United States actually share some of the similar climate change-driven vulnerabilities. So we are here today to exchange thoughts, ideas, and best practices on how
Give Suzanne another moment to see if her internet comes back up. Well, it looks like we may have lost her completely.
Oh, I think she just came back.
I'm back. Okay.
Okay.
New opportunity and exciting initiative that we're supporting for the call to climate change adaptation. And we're standing behind that call. At the World Leaders Summit at COP26, President Biden announced the launch of the President's Emergency Plan for Adaptation and Resilience. I think it's important to remember that adaptation and resilience go hand in hand, and we call this prepare. This is going to serve as the cornerstone of the US government response to the increasing impacts of global climate crisis and will enhance global stability. President Biden made a commitment to work with Congress to provide $3 billion annually in adaptation finance, just in adaptation finance to prepare by the 2024 fiscal year. This is huge. This is the largest US commitment ever made to reduce climate impacts on some of the most vulnerable to climate change worldwide. As part of Prepare, the United States also announced $50 million. This is our first ever contribution to the Adaptation Fund, which ended up receiving $356 million in new support from contributing national and regional governments at COP26. We also announced our support of $25 million to the Least Developed Countries Fund, which received a record $413 million from 12 donor countries at COP26. So why am I telling you about all this? Because with our added support and together with increased private capital and from other donors, we'll be on track to mobilizing $100 billion to support climate action in developing nations. And we continue to call on the world to treat the climate crisis as the crisis it has become. So that's why I'm so excited to see all of you come together today and over the next 10 months to discuss how to best support climate action and adaptation in your protected areas. I'm really looking forward to listening to these fruitful discussions and also to watch you build the networks of contacts in your own country, on your continent, and overseas, because no one can fight the climate crisis alone. So not only the ideas we're going to exchange here are important, but those contacts and the networks you're building. So again, I really thank you I thank you for this opportunity to welcome you. And as we say in Botswana, Pula. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Suzanne. That was a fabulous introduction. All right, everyone, this is Joel Reynolds. I wanted to share a little bit of information about sort of what the genesis of how we picked the topics and the structure for this series. So today is the first of, as Suzanne mentioned, of what's currently planned to be 10 monthly webinars. We'll take a month off in the summer. Basically, the content that we picked is it reflects the influences of two key considerations. One, we had a number of discussions with the executive committee from CASA TFCA, as well as with staff from SANParks to talk about the issues that were of greatest importance to those groups. And then we sent around a survey in the fall asking people about specific topics of interest and things that people wanted to share information on. And so that led to this sequencing of topics. And basically, we're starting today with climate change vulnerability assessments. And then we'll have February's talk will be a little bit more in technical side about talking about climate sensitivities of particular resources, in this case, hydrologic freshwater resources. And then we'll move into discussions about accounting for uncertainty in future climate, predominantly in March around scenario planning and related approaches, and then moving into adaptation actions in April and the Resist, Accept, Direct framework. After that, we're going to move predominantly thinking about to topics of relevance to landscape scale collaborative conservation and working with partners, finding funding, sharing lessons learned on those different issues. So that's the overall arch for the course of the next 11 months or so. Let's see here. Yes. If you want to share the work you're doing related to any of these topics, or you have colleagues that you think would be really have information that they'd like to share, please send me an email or put something in the chat here. I have a certain number of names, but I'm basically going to be recruiting speakers for the sessions, for the later sessions. So please send me your interest and the topics that you'd like to share your information on. Additionally, I do want to say the intention is to have all of these be the last Wednesday of every month. So we're going to keep it on that calendar. The recordings will be made available after the fact on these. The next session, we generally will get an announcement out via email to the registration list that we have, which we keep growing, about 3 weeks prior with a link to register for the next presentation. So hopefully by the end of next week, we'll get the announcement out for the February session on hydrology, and we'll give a little bit on freshwater, and we'll give a little bit of more information about that at the end of today's discussions. Let's see, right. And with that, I'm going to pass it back to Melanie before we jump into the talks.
Okay, thank you, Joel. Yeah, I want to do just some quick introductions. There are a lot of people here today, which is fantastic. So we don't have time to introduce everyone verbally, but we want to hear from you, and we encourage you to get to know each other. So a lot of people have already started doing this, but if you haven't, if you could now go to the chat box and introduce yourself in the chat by entering your name, position title, perhaps organization, and the country you're joining us from. I'm going to enter my name in now. You can scan this list here and see the breadth of sectors and places people are joining from. So welcome everyone again, and thank you so much for being here. Another way that we'd like to get to know you a little better is through a couple of polls that I'm going to launch now. So if you're sitting at your desk, you should see a screen pop up. And the question we have for you is, what is the best description of your organization? We have a list of options below. You can select the one that most directly applies to you. TFCA National Park, protected area, provincial district or non-US federal agency, academia, nonprofit organization, another stakeholder organization, community member, US government, and student are your options. So I'll give that a few moments for people to select their answer, and then I'll share the results. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and end this poll in 3, 2, 1. And you should now see the results. Looks like we've got 24% from protected area, 20% nonprofit organization, 10% from a university, 25% US government. Okay, but it's a nice range. Thank you for doing that. I have one more question for you. So I'm going to stop sharing this one and launch the second question. And this is one that we're very interested to know. So the question is, the most important thing I'd like to learn, not just today, but in this entire series is, please select the option below. Learn what other organizations are doing. Discover tools that I can implement now. Identify potential new partnerships. Fill gaps in my organization's knowledge. And how to prioritize my next action. This one requires a little bit more reflection, so I'll give it a few more extra moments on that. Wow, responses are still rolling in. Okay, 84%, that's pretty good. I'm gonna end this poll and let's look at the results. It's pretty evenly divided between all of the options, which is great. I think these are all goals of the series in some way or another. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing this. Thank you for participating in our introductory series here. I look forward to continuing to hear your responses in the chat as we move forward through the presentations, and I'll be moderating that conversation. But now I will hand it to Joel to introduce our speakers.
Great. Thank you, Melanie. And thank you, everyone. Good to get to know a little bit about each of you. Obviously, we can't be nice to run through introductions with everybody, but time doesn't allow. So I want to shift to introducing our first speaker. I would remind everybody to please, just to save bandwidth, to turn off your video feed and to mute your audio, unless you are John Gross. So our first speaker is John Gross. He's an ecologist with over 17 years experience with the U.S. National Park Service, spending that time first with the Inventory and Monitoring Program, helping stand that up here at the National Park Service, and then came over and joined the Climate Change Response Program. John helps parks and other protected areas prepare for and adapt to climate changes by generating, interpreting, and applying science to address the issues and needs of parks. He's conducted research and worked with protected area managers in a multitude of countries since 1986, leading and participating in projects focusing on wildlife behavior and population dynamics, disease ecology, ecosystem ecology, climate vulnerability, and climate adaptation. So lots of experience. It's published broadly on climate adaptation and related topics, including major contributions to the Climate Change Vulnerability Assessment Guide, Scanning the Conservation Horizon, the Climate Smart Adaptation Guide, and the IUCN Best Practice Guidelines for Climate Adaptation. And most recently, he's helped collaborate on a major analysis of climate vulnerability assessments for all 400 plus National Park Service units. So with that, I want to hand it over to John. John, if you want to share your screen and begin your slideshow, that will be great.
Okay, thank you for that introduction. I'm honored and thrilled to be here with you today. And if I get lucky, this will come up here. Can you see the screen now?
I can. There you go. Looks good.
Excellent. So I'll get rolling. As I said, it's an honor and a pleasure to be here this morning. And this presentation, I think, will fit really nicely with the next one, that this will be a really high-level overview of climate change assessment, vulnerability assessments for protected areas, kind of a bit of a focus on what we've learned. And to start out, you folks already know this, that 9 of the 10 hottest years are in the last decade. The climate is changing, it's getting warmer, nothing new there. It's also getting warmer in your part of the world. And there's a couple of publications in here by people that are on the webinar this morning, just showing that it's not only something that's happened globally, but obviously it's happening, locally everywhere. And our parks are just as affected in the US as the parks in Africa are. So the real question, of course, then is the climate changing? It's what do we do about it? And that's what this webinar is about. The first thing I'd want to stress is that this is a general climate adaptation cycle that we use. This is essentially the climate smart cycle that came out in the guide to climate smart climate change. And it kind of goes around the circle. And you've all seen things similar to this, that starting at the top, informing the process of collecting the information, what are your goals? Vulnerability assessments then are to the right there, kind of the step number 2 in this particular cycle. And this is pretty generic. The colored circles around there represent, in our portrayal of this, the fact that we really stress using multiple climate futures, or encompassing and embracing the uncertainty that we have in things like climate projections and the responses of the systems that we manage to it. Going around the circle, looking at evaluating management goals, particularly in the light of those vulnerability assessments, where you may find that some of your pre-existing management goals are no longer realistic and achievable. Identifying adaptation options, selecting those strategies, implementing and monitoring, and of course, evaluating and going back around the circle. The RAD framework that Melanie mentioned earlier falls in here of, what are the responses that you might have. So really the emphasis here is to just realize that vulnerability assessments are not the endpoint. Vulnerability assessments are early in this adaptation cycle. And really what we want to get to is adaptation and not just doing the vulnerability assessments. But it's a really critical foundational early step in the process. So just then to talk a little bit about vulnerability, we define it as degree to which a physical, biological, or socio-economic system is susceptible and unable to cope with the adverse impacts of climate change. And then I'll just mention key vulnerabilities. That key vulnerabilities are those that merit more attention because they pose the greatest risk to achieving conservation goals and objectives. Two things about this. First off, in vulnerability, notice that the scale and the target of that can be virtually anything, and that'll come out as we go forward this morning. The second thing is the key vulnerabilities, that it doesn't necessarily mean that the thing that's most vulnerable in your park or the system or whatever you're evaluating, that may not be the one that most threatens that achieving the particular management or conservation goals that you have there. So just realize that as you rank things as higher and lower higher and lower vulnerability, that probably won't be exactly the same ranking as the highest management needs that you have. So to talk about, what can a climate change vulnerability assessment tell you? What is it that you want to get from it? First off, of course, is what resources, facilities, or values are most likely to be affected by projected climate variations. So those are, both changes, increases in temperature, as well as we know the variation, hotter hots and colder colds extremes. And that, of course, informs management decisions and priorities for research and other studies. You want to know why something is vulnerable to climate change. That is, what sorts of actions might be taken. And almost always, you want to know where and when these impacts are going to occur. That obviously there's a huge amount of variation across the landscape, and at some level, at some point, you need to know where should the management actions take place, and you frequently need to know how urgent is it. Is this something that you're worried about, extinction is imminent in the next, 5 to 10 or 15 years, or is this something that you're looking at impacts, but they might not really be felt for the next century, and that can have a pretty important consequences then for the sorts of management actions that you're taking and the scheduling of those actions. To drill down just a little bit more into climate change vulnerability, this is a generalized framework. It's not the only one, and in some cases, probably not the best one, but it's the one that's most commonly used. It's kind of a de facto standard in many parts of the world. And we think of it as three major elements contributing to vulnerability. And the first of those is exposure, and I'll go through all of these individually. That's up in top, it's the light blue boxes. That's essentially exposure to climate change. The second is the sensitivity of whatever you're conducting the assessment on to those exposures. And those together then tell you about the potential impact of climate changes either have already occurred or occurring or going to occur in the future. And those can be ameliorated by adaptive capacity. And adaptive capacity is essentially the ability of the organism or system to respond. And together that tells you about the vulnerability of the system. In the Park Service, we tend to consider adaptive capacity as a trait that's only characteristic of living organisms. But in many other situations, people look at the ability of communities to respond as a part of adaptive capacity too. And adaptive capacity and sensitivity are sometimes quite difficult to tease apart. And my take on it is it really doesn't matter. As long as you're addressing them in your assessment, you can call them whatever you want. So to kind of drill down a little bit then into what these elements are, exposure we think of as the nature and degree to which a system is exposed to significant climate variation. And that variation can be things like, in the graph in the upper right there, vapor pressure deficit. It can be something that's a dramatic increase, or in some cases, it's just the fact that things are becoming much more variable. So it may be that your annual rainfall is the same as it's always been, but now it's coming in fewer and much more intense rainfall events, which is a pattern that is pretty generic around the world with climate change. Exposure is almost always the easiest thing to evaluate in a vulnerability assessment. So, and it's typically, we started looking primarily at temperature and precipitation, but realistically, in a lot of parts of the world, temperature and precipitation doesn't tell you a lot about the story. And we found that most of our parks really can't interpret what, a 1 or 2 degree temperature variation, increase in temperature in the summer means. It's just like that's kind of a warm summer. So we've really moved on and looked much more at trying to look at indices of drought and hydrology, for example, that, a lot of times it's really about water in parks. And if you're working in aquatic systems or the ocean, it can be pH or salinity or, storm frequency, those sorts of things. The other thing I'd stress here is that frequently averages don't really tell you a lot about the system. It's those extreme events that are really consequential for systems. Those are the ones that are that are changing, that are causing floods and droughts. And, so we often tend to look at things like the lower right, days that are above the historic 95th percentile for temperatures, or rainfall that's, greater than 10 centimeters, or, whatever is the appropriate metric for the system. To look at sensitivity then, that's the degree to which something is or is likely to be affected by a response to those climate changes to which it's exposed. And sensitivity is often much more difficult to get at than exposure. Exposure, you can generally use global climate models and frequently other kind of large scale, readily available data. Sensitivity is starting to really look at the traits of the individual species or systems, the physiology, the behavior, habitat specificity of organisms. They're often influenced by other stressors. So for example, organisms that are exposed to a lot of pollution frequently are much more susceptible to temperature changes. If you're looking at structures, or for us, we have a lot of cultural resources and buildings, that building material and the maintenance of it can be highly consequential for the sensitivity. Or for example, if you're looking at cultural events, and we have cherry blossom festivals and flower festivals, and it's becoming increasingly difficult that now the traditional time of those festivals, the flowers have already come and gone. So it's kind of a whole range of sensitivities, but they tend to be much more intrinsic characteristics of the organism or the site that you're trying to evaluate. Assessing sensitivity, again, looking at seasonal or environmental cues, the maintenance that's been had, the maintenance schedule, if you've got a database on that, and damage from precipitation, winds, freeze-fall cycles, all of those are the sorts of things that organisms tend to be susceptible to. To move on to adaptive capacity then, this really refers to the ability of a system to accommodate or cope with the climate changes with minimal disruption. For organisms, obviously some of them can get up and move. We're finding increasingly that many organisms surprisingly have surprising adaptive evolutionary capacity, that they've got the genetic variation that allows for subpopulations or microevolution. And a lot of organisms can modify their behavior, the time of day that they come up. Assessing adaptive capacity, again, is frequently, some of it's trait-based, but there's behavioral plasticity, the genetic diversity that organism has, the evolutionary potential. In some cases, it's ecosystem processes. So for example, some ocean estuaries are able to actually accumulate biomass and sediments and keep up with sea level rise. And then when we think about ecosystems, many times redundancy is really important, that there's sufficient metapopulations to recolonize areas or ecosystem processes that have some redundancy built into it. So those are kind of the fundamental elements of adaptive capacity. And those are common for, a very large number of vulnerability assessments. So next is kind of what have we learned about designing a vulnerability assessments? And I think this is really important, that unfortunately, there are a lot of assessments that just fail to meet management needs. And so this kind of thinking about, if you're commissioning or conducting a vulnerability assessment, it's fairly basic stuff, and some of it's pretty obvious, but surprisingly, basically people blow it a lot. And first is, the no-brainer. Identify what the needs are in the decision processes. That vulnerability assessments that can target a specific decision or decision process are much more likely to be successful in influencing management. Determining objectives and scope, same as pretty much anything else. Looking at what your assessment targets and spatial scale is it that you're looking at the entire range of a species or a species within a protected area? Is it that you're looking at the ecosystems within a park or the entire extent of the ecosystem? Often with cultural resources, are you looking at the site, the materials, or everything within a park? So there's a variety of assessment targets, and all of them are valid and important. And the more that you add to an assessment, probably the less detail you're going to get on any of them. So it's not necessarily a simple question to address that. Always available data and expertise. It doesn't make a lot of sense to design an assessment if there's no way to evaluate it. The required level of confidence and cost and time are always an element. I'll come back to required level of confidence, but you really need to match the vulnerability assessment to the characteristics of the people that are going to use it. And I'd really stress that most parks will need and use multiple assessments. That, the first one that you do, you might be better off with a fairly coarse scale filter assessment. later on rolling down into detail, there's lots of ways to kind of talk about vulnerability assessment methodologies, and you can think about trait-based or correlational or mechanistic. I just tend to think of them often as being on a spectrum from kind of qualitative to quantitative assessments. The qualitative assessments, which I often actually really like, rely a lot on I'll call it expert opinion, but it's probably better to say local expertise. Who are your subject matter experts? They can rely very heavily on conceptual models of how your system operates and where are the decision points, where essentially the levers that you might pull. They can work with generalized climate futures. We think of climate futures as those kind of physical expressions of the future climate, and they can be relatively fast and frequently less expensive. Kind of looking at the other end of the spectrum are, highly quantitative, usually computer-based models, ecosystem models, species, population dynamics models. I mean, you can link a global climate change model to a dynamic vegetation model that projects habitats to a species population model. They often involve detailed, perhaps dynamic, regional dynamic downscaled climate projections. The quantitative ones are often data and resource intensive, and they're often long and expensive, but they're not necessarily better. If you've really got the capacity to fire off, ecosystem models and all of that, they can give you a lot of great information, but it may be that exceeds what the park managers are actually capable of using. So, frequently we don't have much in the way of our management toolkit. So just to kind of stress it again, the assessment really has to fit the decision and the decision makers. Who's going to use it? What's the level of information that they have? And, what's the purpose of the assessment? And assessments can, address a variety of purposes. They're not, they may be for a specific park, but in a system like the National Park Service, we need assessments, on this left vertical scale at the national continental level. What does our Washington office and our director need in terms of allocating resources to regions or to groups of parks? We have regional needs within, our National Park Service is divided into a series of now Department of Interior regions that allocate resources and look at vulnerabilities and organize studies, or it could be for a single group. It can be a single issue. Are you looking at a particularly an iconic species like, Joshua trees or saguaros or for you, it could be lions or giraffes or whatever, or you're looking at all of the resources in a park. And then again, the effort and detail per park is probably going to vary depending on where these are. In terms of the National Park Service, we have all of these. We've got the NP Vaughan study where we're looking at strategies for conducting parks. We've conducted sea level rise studies that, at the regional scale, We've also conducted sea level rise facility vulnerability assessments for parks and at individual parks. I put trait-based assessments and species distribution modeling kind of going vertically up and down here because sometimes those can be done at a high level of specificity for single species. Like we've got a really great one that focuses specifically on Joshua trees, or they can be some of the kind of things that Wendy Foden's worked on. That's look at large groups of species. We also have comprehensive parks, and I kind of put a question mark that I don't know if you can really do a comprehensive study at the regional scale. It's really difficult to have a high level of detail at a broad scale. So looking at all of that, then the next question is, we never have enough time, we never have enough money. How can we get vulnerability assessments done at the system level? And we've spent several years working on that. That NP Vaughan study, which is available on the web, is one of the ways that we've tried to address that. We started out looking at a whole bunch of variables and rolled those down into factors. We've evaluated them by a resource type and geography, looking at either adding up all of the scores for the 40-some variables or looking at specific high impact factors that can be transformational. Okay, my screen doesn't seem to be changing here. Oh, there we go. And those number of factors roughly, of course, indicate kind of, the difficulty of measuring those things. Just really look at just one result, which is the high impact factors, which we identified as sea level rise, fire, drought, forest insect pest and disease. We also identified freshwater flooding, but there was inadequate information to identify parks that were at high risk. And again, these are things that really can be transformational for your park. And just to pull out a result of that, which was really an eye-opener for, I think, all of us involved in the study, was that when we looked at that, kind of the bottom line was that about 57% of our parks were considered to be highly vulnerable, which was really pretty astonishing. And when we assessed the overall vulnerability scores, that was 70% of our parks. So basically, almost 3/4 of our parks are really at risk of climate change. When we looked at ways to, get the vulnerability assessments done strategically, we identified a whole bunch of strategies that we could do that, grouped in by geography or factor or resource, or looking at, specific parks. And I just mentioned that there are ways to try to address these factors. So then to go back of what have we learned, what are best practices, evaluating all of the factors of vulnerability, exposure, sensitivity, analyzing historical climate changes and multiple climate futures, that is embracing the uncertainty that we know about and thinking about strategies that accommodate those, including climate and non-climate factors, evaluating observed and anticipated changes that have already occurred and trying to attribute those to climate change, obviously addressing uncertainties, including spatial information of where is it and when is it, and also a narrative whenever possible. If you're doing hundreds of species, the narrative probably is going to be difficult, but our managers have said the narratives with that information, they can roll that directly into their management plans. So then just to summarize, the target is really climate adaptation. It's not vulnerability assessment, but there's a lot of resources available, and vulnerability assessments are foundational. There's no one size fits all. It has to fit the purposes and the decisions. And it's also, I'd stress that, vulnerability assessments are not one and done. You may need an initial kind of high level, course filter assessment of, what do you think's most at risk, and then drill down in that. But as we learn more about climate impacts and changes, and as the climate changes, you'll need to revisit those vulnerability assessments and either become more detailed or include more targets. And with that, I'll say thank you.
All right.
Over to our next speaker.
Wonderful, John. Thank you very much. That was excellent. I did want to remind people to please, if you have questions or comments about that came up in John's presentation, please put them in the chat. We're going to compile them, and we'll ask the speakers to answer them in the discussion section after the next talk. So please go ahead and start putting those in the chat. Thank you, John. Thank you very much. I now want to introduce our next speaker, Nicola van Wilken. And Nicola, while I'm doing this, do you want to try and share your screen while I'm doing this? So Nicola is a global change scientist with South Africa National Parks. Her research addresses policy and management relevant science needs in the fields of alien species, climate change, and resource use in national protected areas, including completion of an assessment of the extent and impact of various global change drivers on national parks in South Africa. She earned her PhD from Stellenbosch University for research focused on trade and risk assessment for non-native reptiles and amphibians. She has broad interest in biology, ecology, conservation, ecosystem management, and data collection and analysis. Currently, Nicola is working on assessing climate change vulnerability for species in national parks, as well as researching potential species climate change adaptation options. Again, I encourage people to put questions and things they want to share related to the talks in the chat. And with that, I'll hand it over to Nicola. And did screen share work, or do we want to run it off my?
Sadly, I think we're going to be doing a collaboration, John.
Fine. Absolutely. That's great.
Unfortunately, it didn't want to work.
That's totally fine. And just remember to let me know when I should be advancing things. So
I'll just say click if that's okay.
Sure.
Yeah. Okay, so thanks everyone. I'm really excited about this opportunity, and I think John's talk has really got me thinking of all kinds of ideas, and I'm glad to see that we're thinking kind of along similar lines. And I'm going to be talking a bit about the work that we're doing in SANParks, and it's really very broad, and you'll see from our mandates that we have why it has to be broad. So Joel, if you'll flip between the next two slides, just to give people that aren't from South Africa an idea of the local context. We live in a country, you can flip between this one and the next one, where there are 9 terrestrial biomes and several marine biomes as well. And in this slide, you can see the distribution of our national parks in relation to those biomes. We've got 20 national parks at the moment, and not included in the parks that we manage are also provincial level parks and nature reserves. We just manage the national level parks. You can click. Doesn't seem to be, there we go. Right, so similar to the US situation, we have a number of assessments that we've done nationally. We're very lucky. We have a national biodiversity assessment that takes place every 3 to 5 years. We've got national maps of sea level rise. We've got the CSIR that has done municipal risk profiles looking at socio-economic vulnerabilities and predicted climate change down at ward level. We've had obviously the global change assessment work that we've done within national parks to look at various drivers of change. And we've also had teams of people doing workshops with landowners and with park managers. So from all of these, we've realized that we have many vulnerabilities and that they are diverse. So you can click. We have then started working on a climate change preparedness strategy that looks at 5 pillars. So we're trying to understand climate change, move on to adapting to climate change. We're also working on mitigation, so quantifying our carbon footprint. I'm not going to talk about that today. And then moving from this towards helping and communicating our findings. So most of my talk today is going to focus around the understanding component, but I'll also mention 1 or 2 of our other projects. Right, so in terms of understanding, just for those that are not familiar with SANParks, you need to know that we've got 3 core mandates. So it's not just biodiversity and cultural heritage conservation, but we're also striving to diversify our responsible tourism, making parks inclusive for everybody and really accessible to everybody. And we're also trying to work in the realm of socio-economic transformation, ensuring that our parks are not at a detriment to anybody and that we share our resources where that is possible. At the same time, we are 76% self-funded, and I think that number might even be growing. So we rely on revenue from tourism, wildlife sales, and external grants. That's just a bit of context. Now moving on to how we manage our parks, you can click, we'll just go through these steps. I think there's about 5 clicks on this slide. So first off, we have park management plans, which are our core governance structure, and I'll talk a bit more about that in the next slide. But within these park management plans, we have objectives. And over the last couple of years, we've been specifically at the time of a park plan review, which takes place for a park once every 10 years or so, including a climate change objective. And one of the first steps in terms of actions in that objective is to do a vulnerability assessment. Now, given our broad mandates, the scope of these vulnerability assessments are also incredibly broad. So you can just click and you'll see that we need to look at biodiversity, landscape functionality, people, financing, that's our core income stream, as well as cultural heritage. So you can move on, and I'll just give you a bit of an understanding of our park management plan process. So it involves a really detailed stakeholder participation phase, and you can see in that green block, we really consult with the stakeholders that we've identified and that have indicated interest in the process. We define the desired state of the park, and we really come up with a park management plan collectively. So if you click next, you'll see that this process really entails coming up with a vision for the park within our legal and operating principles and in the local context. We list the vital attributes of that particular area. Obviously, we've got a wide number of biomes and different social contexts. And what are the determinants of those attributes? And then we start setting objectives and prioritizing our objectives and setting targets. So that's where our climate change work comes in. And so as mentioned that we've started, you can go to the next slide, including climate change objectives within our park plans. This is just a snapshot of 1 or 2 of the sub-objectives for Agulhas National Park. And you'll see that our objective is to adapt and mitigate negative impacts of climate change through monitoring, research, and implementing our preparedness strategy. And one of our sub-objectives would be to identify the vulnerabilities. It's a collaborative process between scientific services, head of department, park management, and it's obviously guided by our preparedness strategy. So you can click next. What I'm going to be talking to you about is the 4 main approaches that we use to do our climate change vulnerability assessments. So I see Kevin is on this call, which is really exciting because he did some of the exploratory work first out, trying to look at if in the SANParks context, we had to come up with a model that would give us an idea of relative park vulnerabilities, but also park-specific vulnerabilities. What would that look like? And I'll show you a little bit of Kevin's work, which is currently in review, and we're very excited about it. And then we had Moto, who's been doing a lot of work with park managers and also with external stakeholders, workshopping what they feel are the key threats and vulnerabilities and how they think adaptation might be useful. So really understanding the situation on the ground. And then where my work comes in is I've been trying to combine all of this other information with local literature and national literature to really provide those detailed assessments that Joel was talking about at a park level, to understand, really delve into all the different issues. And then lastly, we've been working with our park planners to come up with, once you know broadly what your vulnerabilities are, what do you actually do about that spatially within your park? Is there anything that one should consider in particular areas of your park that might not be relevant in other areas? So because this talk is quite short, I'm literally going to be giving you some snapshots from these 4 types of vulnerability assessments. So you can go to the next slide. This is the last little bit of context. We've already mentioned in the previous presentations how climate is changing. So if you click next, you'll see the blue stars are the parks where we had long temperature records and have detected a significant temperature increase. You can see an example of one of those. As John mentioned, we've also been looking at extreme events, and our hot days and heat waves show a pretty similar pattern. If you click next, then you'll see the light blue stars are the parks where we started these comprehensive vulnerability assessments. Kevin's work covered all of our parks. So if you go next, we will be looking at the outcomes of Kevin's work. So he came up with this really, really cool diagram of how we contextually understand vulnerability within our park system. So I've mentioned that tourism resilience is really important for our funding. So you can see that bottom block is on the right is our tourism resilience, which pours into our financial resilience. So I'm going to talk about all the different blocks. So if you can click on the first one, Joel. So first up, we've got disease safety. So in our context, malaria is a particular concern. So if the vector for malaria shifts, new parks could become vulnerable, and that obviously has some impact on tourism. Next, we have climate comfort, and I've seen some work from US parks where you've mentioned it gets too cold for people to visit, or the seasons change for us. The bigger problem is when it gets too hot. And then we obviously have some charismatic species which might be impacted in their own right. We've also got problems with bush encroachment, where if game viewing is your selling point and nobody can see a meter past their car, that falls out. And all of these work together to impact our tourism. On top of this, we put all of our camps in beautiful locations along rivers and next to the sea, which has its own challenges, as you can imagine. And all of this feeds into our financial resilience. Then we've got resilience in terms of adjacent land use. This affects how our parks can expand, but also permeability to the park in terms of species trying to move in response to climate change. And then we track our management effectiveness in terms of reaching the park objectives in those plans. And all of this adaptive capacity is balanced out against the impact that we're actually seeing. So first off, there's species change, then there's habitat change, and we've got some models of how we expect different biomes to change across the country. And lastly, but most importantly, we've got resource pressure. And where you've got a situation where you've got really poor communities living on the border of a national park which is filled with rich resources, there's a massive potential for conflict of interest. So this has been a really useful theoretical model for us. And you can click next just to show you the results of some of Kevin's work. And you can see here, he's been able to rank the parks in terms of vulnerability, and he's also then identified particular park-specific vulnerability. And we're looking forward to seeing this paper in press. But you'll see, I just wanted to then move on to our next snapshot of vulnerability. The Richtersveld National Park comes out here sort of in the middle of the pack. But that's where our other methods become really useful. If you start diving into the specifics of a particular park, you work out that, you know, there are some local mechanistic things that you can't get with these kind of broad indicators. So Moto, I mentioned, has been doing some really great work with communities, and our Richtersveld National Park is one of the few national parks where we have co-management with the local community who are still living quite a off the land kind of lifestyle, which is increasingly threatened by climate change. So if you go to the next slide, you'll see that what's happening and what we've understood from Moto's interviews and from my literature reviews is that we've got increasingly hot temperatures. I think you're just going to have to click through the mechanisms here. And this being a coastal kind of area leads to a strong sea land temperature difference and strong winds, which then interact with the drought we've been having and the land use, which often comes in the form of overgrazing and mining. And you see plants dying, topsoil being exposed, which combined with the strong wind is just a perfect storm of dust and more loss of topsoil and then less soil to protect next time these winds happen. So that's kind of the situation that we're facing on the ground. And obviously it has massive impacts on the local community. It also has massive impacts on the biological community. So if you go to the next slide, you'll see this is a picture that was taken by one of the monitors in the park, and he actually identified these mass die-outs of species in the recent drought, and he wrote an email in 2015, which I'm going to read to you. He says, "It's with great sadness that I write this email. I today, for the first time in my life, saw the devastating effect of what can only be described as climate change. In 2015, for the first time in my life, we did not experience winter. Temperatures kept on rising above 25. This is now winter, many winter days above 30, and strong east winds daily. All of the near-threatened crassulas," and he goes on to list a whole bunch of species, "were dead, and all of the large plants of other species were dead." And then he says, "Is this the end? If only we could warn the world. We have a big problem. Rapid climate change is a big problem." And he recognizes that, yes, when the rain comes, some things will recover from the seed bank, but if those seed banks have been blown away, it's a really potentially nasty situation. So moving from this to trying to understand, if we know their problems, how we identify where in the landscape they're likely to take place, we'll move on to our next snapshot. And this takes a kind of a deep dive into our park management plans. And so aside from the climate change objective, the park management plan also governs which activities take place in the park and where in the park they occur, things like tourism, recreation, where we need to do rehabilitation and so on. And it governs where these activities happen spatially. So we've used GIS layers to determine the sensitivity, but what we haven't included to date is climate change. So the planners came to me and said, well, how could we include climate change? So if you go to the next project, I'm just going to give you the outline of our project. So we're working with some local scientists such as the Slingsby, and he's done some in-depth study in Table Mountain on the physical characteristics, looking at microclimates, fire history, and soils, and so on. And we're combining this abiotic landscape with species level vulnerability information. And there we've used the IUCN methods that Wendy and colleagues developed to rank species in terms of their vulnerability. And we're combining those vulnerable species distributions with this information, along with socioeconomic vulnerabilities that Kevin helped us work on, looking at infrastructure that's at risk and also how tourism might be at risk. And this can help us inform where the key vulnerabilities are in the spatial landscape. So this is still a bit of a work in progress, but on the next slide, I can show you some of the kinds of things that we can do. You can see that here we've looked at tourism, and interestingly, in Table Mountain National Park, it doesn't get quite as hot. And so actually, as the weather gets better and hotter, the tourism increases. Obviously, negative impact of rainfall, and we found that the tourists are not deterred by our very strong wind in summer. They still come out to see our site. So that's the one component of the project. So where there's not a major train smash in this park, although it will be in others. The next component here is how do the distributions of vulnerable species compare to the distribution of the microhabitats that we've identified, and we've found some really interesting hotspots, and I unfortunately can't go into the detail. But if you click next, this really helps us to start moving from vulnerability to adaptation. So identifying things that might decrease species sensitivities in terms of where to divert footpaths, where to prioritize our alien clearing, restore microhabitats, or even create microhabitats. And I'll be talking about that in a few slides' time. And then obviously also to enhance our adapted capacity in terms of where to move or not have roads, and even one day to theoretically think about assisted reintroduction to suitable microhabitats. Right, you can move on. So this brings us then to more of the adaptation side of things. And I don't have time to speak about this project, but we've got lots of exciting ideas and things on the go. So just the first thing I want to mention is how we've been using these comprehensive vulnerability assessments to, you can click onto the next slide, to inform our management. We've been working with the managers based on our initial interviews that Morto did, and then some of the things that have come out of our recent workshops to try and prioritize, similar to what John mentioned, but all of these potential adaptive actions in terms of how easy they would be to implement and how important they are. And we've classified them according to whether they're research or helping people or communication. And so that can really help identify which units within SANParks need to do these things and how easy it is going to be to get them done. So that's what we're working on at the moment in terms of one of the components of our assessments. Right, next. Within our parks, we've also got really fantastic programs that are run nationally, that are up and running, have been for many years before climate change became the talk of the town. These working for programs assist with fire management, wetland rehabilitation, and alien caring, and it's really fantastic way to employ people, create job creation, and not only help people, but help our ecosystems, and also work towards a bit of mitigation where you're restoring carbon. So yeah, I don't have time for detail, but those are really fantastic existing programs that we can now just add a climate change slant to. And then lastly, in terms of adaptation, I just wanted to highlight one project that we're busy with, which has a look at the African penguin, whose population has plummeted. They're virtually facing extinction at the moment. And one of the key threats historically was loss of nesting habitat. You can see here, these poor guys are trying to nest in the sand where they used to nest in guano, which was all harvested in the early 19th century. But what they're facing now is obviously a whole bunch of climate change threats like wave run-up and heat. Here you can see panting penguins. So the project we're working on at the moment is looking at these nest boxes. You can click next, and trying to work out which types of nest boxes provide the optimal habitat for penguins to breed in. And we've got a whole collaborative project across a number of partners looking at types of things that we can do to alleviate at least the climate change pressure while we work on solutions for the other pressures that the species faces. Right, and sorry if this is all too much, but there's one last thing that I just wanted to share with you. So our parks, obviously we have to do a lot of work inside them, but if we don't work outside our parks in the broader landscape, then I think we will be failing. So the first thing I wanted to mention was, you can click to the next slide, that while we do have some parks where we've got small communities, the human population is not large, and we have massive opportunity to work with those communities in terms of help and adaptation. In other contexts, it's not always such a positive situation. So you can click next. So where we have negative attitudes towards our park, it might be in terms of damage causing animals that escape from farms and threaten livelihoods. And in other instances, parks are seen as a forbidden haven of resources. You've got fat plump animals, while livestock struggle to persist on overused land outside the parks. And in a world where we're really fighting, many of us, for increased conservation area, and models indicate we need up to 40% of the Earth area conserved to live sustainably, we're actually trying to justify for the existence of the parks that we currently have. So, second to last slide. One of the managers asked me when we were doing these vulnerability assessments, how is my park different? And this got me to thinking, if we really want to solve these problems, obviously we've got biome-specific issues, we've got land use, we've got whether our park is borehole supplied with water, whether we've got permanent water in an arid or permanent water in a wet environment or seasonal water. And all of these things interact together to influence natural productivity, the human population size, our stakeholder needs, the natural disturbance regime, whether or not we have megafauna, and obviously adaptation options, which will depend on our park size as well. So on the one end, you might have really high natural productivity and high human need, and you can click next there, Joel. And this really impacts on our adaptation options. We might have high conflict, limits on expansion, but at the same time, we've got a huge role for communication and nature-based solutions. Whereas on the other end, we might have low productivity and low human population size with lots of opportunity for people and parks to work together, but we've got limits then probably on in terms of how expensive it is to do rehab and so on. And what we really need to do, and what we're really excited to do as part of this collaboration, is maybe take a look at your scenario planning tools to work out what happens in all these in-between spaces, because obviously it's quite a continuum. So the last slide is the areas that we might want to look at. If you just click next, in terms of where we're going to want to move in terms of adaptation and helping, obviously fire management, damage causing animals, pest management, water management, ecological reserves, poverty and inequality, alien species management, or all issues that we have to deal with, while at the same time trying to provide people with a very essential access to nature experiences and sustainable, nutritious food production and sound waste management. So we're really looking forward to the collaborations that we have planned. There's so much more to learn and so much exciting things that we can do with US Parks and with the embassy coming on board. And we've also got 2 applications for the Fulbright Specialist Exchange Program. And yeah, we're just really looking forward to working with all of you. So thanks to you and thanks to my colleagues and all of our sponsors.
Okay, wow, thank you so much. I'm so impressed with the amount of information that we received in such a short period of time. Thank you so much for putting together those very, very informative presentations. A lot of really great information. Lots of opportunity to go back and clarify and discuss more. We have another 25 minutes together, so I'm excited to do that. But before we shift to questions and discussion, I'd like to ask everyone for one more favor, and that is to create a group photo, so to speak. So if you have a webcam right now, I invite you to turn it on, and I will take a series of screenshots to capture this group photo. If you are in speaker view, you can now switch to gallery view and wave at your fellow attendees. And if you don't have a webcam, we are still waving back at you. So bear with me for just a moment while I capture these. Everybody give a good smile. Smile awkwardly for a couple more moments. His eyes go to the next screen. And one more. Wonderful. Okay, thank you for bearing with me as we attempt to connect with each other over such great distances and time, as it is, sun is just coming up where I am at, and you are just ending your day on the other side of the world. Okay, now let's go ahead. Thank you for doing that. We're going to jump to questions. Please enter your questions and comments in the chat. I am going to send you a couple while we get ready to discuss here. One of my questions for the group here, our audience, is, have you conducted a vulnerability assessment? And of all the methods that you learned between John and Nicola, what methods did you use? Another question that I'm curious about are, what are the challenges you face in assessing vulnerability to climate change? And while we wait for your responses in the chat, you can also, if you want to, we do have time. If you feel like you have a comment or question, but it's hard to put it in text, you could raise your hand and we can unmute you and talk that way. Gregor's got a question for us. He says, can we see Nicola's map slide again, showing us which parks have had a vulnerability assessment thus far? Joel, that's going to be on you to share your screen again and find the slide that shows which parks have had a vulnerability assessment thus far.
I'm on it. Give me a minute here. Let's see here. And Nicola, if you know what slide.
Slide 10.
Okay.
Slide 10.
Oh, she knows the number even.
There we go.
Thanks a lot, Nicola. I just wanted another look, but maybe it's the question behind it is, why were the parks who've had their VAs done so far been the ones, and what was the prioritization among parks in going through them?
So what we've tried to do is align the vulnerability assessments with the review of the park management plan, because that's when all of the other information that has to do with that park is generally updated and collated. So it makes sense to align them. In the first year, we committed to doing 5, so we couldn't have perfect alignment. And then COVID meant that we actually did a whole bunch of parks that reviews have actually been postponed until this year. So but going forward, pretty much we're aiming to do at least 2 per year in alignment with, we generally review 2 to 3 park plans per year.
Okay, thank you. We have a question from Titus. He asks, where are they bioremediating strategies that promote the biocrust of dryland soils? And Titus, you're welcome to unmute and elaborate on that if you'd like. Where there are bioremediating strategies that promote. Anybody have any ideas on that?
Bootsy,
Okay.
you're on the call. Is this something that you and Morto have been working on? So I haven't done any work myself in this area, but we do have colleagues that are working in Namakwa National Park and Tankwa-Karoo National Park and Richtersveld, which are very dryland areas. And they've been looking at a whole bunch of adaptation options. Our main challenge there is, firstly, there's not a lot of water. And there's all that wind and so on that I showed you, and actually getting access to these areas, they're very remote, so it's very costly. But I can't find my colleague who's the lead on that work. I don't see him on the call, but I'm hoping that as a later part of the series, they'll be able to share some of that information.
Yeah, I know we have a series of people also. I think particularly of Joe Belknap comes to mind first, because we also have a lot of soil crust, and ours tends to be lichens and things. And, you know, there's always the obvious thing that most of our damage seems to occur because of trampling and breaking up of the soil. But I know that in some areas, depending on whether you're looking at a really extensive area, that people have tried, for example, of applying things like carbohydrates actually on some of these soils. Also, of course, there are the strategies of just reducing the wind load. So it's kind of the obvious stuff that you want things on the ground. So you don't want to just, you know, brush and down vegetation debris, anything that reduces, you know, wind erosion and that sort of thing. But I think most of those are probably fairly apparent, you know, things that reduce erosion and basically reduce the damage to it. But again, I'm not an expert in that either.
Okay, thank you. Larry has a question in the chat, and it's sort of for the panel, sort of for the audience. You know, we listened to the vulnerability assessment and adaptation concepts presented by John and Nicola, and he wants to know, how do these apply at the level of geographic scope, range of communities and other stakeholders, and particular challenges in TFCAs like Kaza and the Great Limpopo? Is there anybody on the call today that'd like to explore that question? And Nicola, do you have a sense of what the potential is to apply the assessment methods you talked about today to the TFCAs?
Absolutely. Unfortunately, the parts that I've been doing most of my work in are not transfrontier, but they will be coming up probably in the next rounds, and I think it'll be really interesting to explore that. Because just from the previous climate change and global change assessment that we've seen that there are issues that play out in one country that impact what happens in the other country. So it's definitely something that we are going to look at when we get to those parts where it's relevant.
And that gets to another question that Joel and I were wondering yesterday, and that is just recognizing, how do you balance the needs for focused assessments on individual parks, as you've been doing it, versus the need to provide information to a large geographic area in a more general way?
So I don't know if John wants to answer that. I mean, his plate, I thought my plate was full with 20 national parks, but he has 400. I think Kevin's work is the only thing that we've really done across everything. But my colleague Morto has actually done the interviews across all of the parks as well. So it's blood, sweat, and tears, I think, is the answer. But yeah, I think the different types of assessments require different needs and inputs. So the more desktop-based stuff one can do in a quicker span of time, but it's always a trade-off between detail and getting national coverage.
Yeah, I'd say the same thing. I mean, you just really have to look at the needs of parks, and obviously in the strategies, which, that we identified within Pivon, it has both of those things. And so included in that set of strategies were, for us, again, it's the questions that you're going to address with 20 parks versus 430 is pretty different. So I think from our perspective, that at least being sure that we can provide some information on climate change to all of the parks is really important, because part of this whole thing is capacity building of the staff. And so it's really difficult to jump immediately with a park that's not aware of climate changes and what's happening in their park into a detailed adaptation plan. So I think all of these kinds of activities are really complementary in that, you can't be thinking, do we do detailed assessments or do we do the really broad scale? That it really needs to be a multi-pronged approach, so that when you go to a park, you can say, well, yeah, you might not have a climate station in your park, but we know we have these gridded products. And sure, they're not going to be as accurate as the station on the ground, but we can give you something you can work with. So you can get started now. You can start talking to your staff, to the rangers that are in the field, to the administrators who may need to be brought up to speed on what's happening. So they're really complementary strategies, and I don't see them as a either or, but it's always a balancing act. Never enough time, never enough money. So you just have to look at your system. But I think linking the vulnerability assessments with management plans is it makes perfect sense, and we're doing similar things here.
Okay, thanks, John. We're getting some really great discussion going on now, and I want to add this comment here from Patty. My challenge and frustration is to know, when is the damage observed the result of climate change factors, or is climate simply exposing incorrect or uninformed land management practices over many years? Is there any comment on that from our panel? Gregor, your hand is up. Do you have a comment for us?
Yeah, just a quick one, that in some of our scenario work, which is basically a VA and then you go into adaptation, one of our early steps is to say, okay, we've got the obvious stressors on a resource, climatic stressors. Maybe it's crossing a heat threshold, maybe it's a change in freeze-thaw dynamics. But to make sure we're not leaving anything behind, we also say, what are those traditional stressors of the resource that are being influenced by climate change, or potentially are influenced by climate change? So we sweep both the direct and what we call the indirect effects in together in getting an idea of the vulnerability of a resource. And a classic example I think will resonate in South Africa is, let's say you have a riverine riparian system. You're concerned about it going dry. Maybe it's fed by local groundwater, and you're concerned that there's already some conflict between groundwater pumping outside the park and your system. And then you think about climate change, which is likely to intensify that groundwater pumping outside of the park. So an effect that might have formerly not been seen as a climate change impact could become a powerful indirect climate change impact based on how it causes people to behave.
Okay, thanks, Gregor. Yeah, John?
I would just add to that, when I do presentations to parks on climate change, one of the slides I typically use, almost always use, probably 95% of the time, is that thinking of climate change as a threat multiplier. That at least in our systems, it's far more frequent that climate change exacerbates something that's already happened, whether it's invasive species or it's fire frequency or it's flooding or something else. It's in most cases in our parks, it's not an absolutely new threat. It's just that it's something that you've had already is now a much, much larger threat. So, it's probably not critical to actually distinguish those, but, you've got to deal with everything. And the, example I used in the talk was that, particularly in aquatic systems, species that are exposed to high pollution levels are far more sensitive to temperature changes. So I don't think you really want to be trying to separate those too much. As a manager, you've got to deal with them regardless of, what the cause is.
Okay, thanks. We had a comment from, and I apologize if I mispronounced this, Dieter Nil. And I saw that your hand, or Larry saw that your hand was up earlier. Do you want to make any additional comments about the vulnerability assessment you're conducting currently?
Yes, hello. Thanks a lot. Yeah, yeah. It's just for information. Like, we are currently preparing a vulnerability assessment for Malawi, Zambia, TFCA. This is in response to CASA and Greater Limpopo TFCA. So this will also be in the two countries, of course. And there will be two levels of vulnerability assessment. One will be on the entire TFCA, where we'll bring together the main stakeholder groups at the main TFCA level, which are the TFCA management structures. Then we will have sort of let's say, everybody concerned with biodiversity, so the park managers and so on. We will have the local administration there, and then we will have the tourism sector as one of the main sectors, plus community representatives at a higher level. And then we will zoom down into a region of a smaller region within the TFCA. TFCA are these transfrontier conservation areas, for those that are not familiar with it. And then we zoom down into an area where we work with a couple of local communities and do the same thing, simplified with these communities for their areas and sort of land use systems. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Yes. We have several questions asking about vulnerability assessments in communities bordering national parks. I'm going to ask this one here that says, hello all, excellent work you have been doing as always. I was wondering if you have done some work on pressures on resources in the parks by communities adjacent to protected areas as a result of climate change, directly or indirectly, including alternative livelihoods they have versus from inside the parks.
So, Melanie, if I may, I'd like to defer this question to Kevin, because this was one of the things that he did actually include in the assessments that he did. We've done a little bit of other work, but maybe Kevin can respond and I can add to what he says. Kevin, if I can put you on the spot like that, are you still with us?
Yes, I am still here. Thanks very much for the opportunity, Nicola. Yes, so this is most certainly something that is taken into account in the vulnerability assessments for protected areas. I have applied the methodology or the framework to a number of different protected areas, and there are always different needs from the managing organization or interested parties. So in some instances, I've included more focus on communities and livelihoods. For example, in Namibia, a lot of the conservancies, there are people living within the protected area or the conserved area. So their alternative livelihoods are an extremely important component. And so that features more predominantly in the vulnerability assessment methodology. Whereas for the South African national parks, it was included as well. So the impact of climate change on the on communities living within a buffer zone around the protected areas. And this was largely looking at how are their livelihoods going to be impacted, and would this likely result in more reliance on protected area resources. So these are definitely things that can be factored into the vulnerability assessments. And it really depends on on what kind of questions you are wanting to answer, or the outcomes that you're trying to achieve from the vulnerability assessment. I hope I've answered that sufficiently. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Kevin. We do have at least one other question that asks, sort of gets at, how do we identify adaptation options for the communities bordering these parks as well? That's helpful.
So if I can quickly add to what Kevin said, I mean, we've been working on a national task team to look at, it's a completely different thing, but it's a resource use and utilization and sharing kind of strategy. And ultimately, we need a kind of different model than we've used all these years with these little blocks of protected areas, and trying to think about how we can actually use our natural resources as part of our industry. So farming with ungulates and medicinal plants and all that kind of thing beyond our protected areas is one of the key things that we have to start thinking about, how to increase the distribution of these species beyond our protected areas, at the same time providing opportunities to people. So I think that's a really exciting space to work in, and something that we need to change our traditional thinking around.
Okay, thank you. I think we have time for one more question. I am going to save this chat, and I hope it's not too bold to ask our speakers to answer just a couple more questions offline. There's not that many, and I can provide that in the follow-up email to this whole group. I have a question for John. Have you carried out vulnerability assessments on marine protected areas? Were there, if so, any particular challenges or approach modifications needed? SANParks hasn't assessed MPAs yet and would appreciate any guidance.
Yeah, unfortunately, Wendy, I haven't actually participated in any of those myself. We have a coastal resources branch and other people in the Park Service, but I think NOAA is the organization in the United States that's worked a lot on that, and I suspect most of the main players, Lori Hansen and her group at EcoAdapt, have done a lot of work in that, and along with the people in NOAA. But I could follow up with you offline if that would be helpful.
I would just also add, I haven't really been tracking this the last couple of years, but certainly there was a lot of activity early in the teens off California coast for marine protected areas, as well as in the Pacific Islands. So Wendy, send an email. We can try and direct you to some of those folks to find out how that has gone and fared.
Okay, there's just one more topic on here that we haven't quite touched on, and that is a question from Judy. Are there projections for commercial agriculture regions? Agriculture must play a vital role, and I don't believe that farmers are well informed. Any comments on that?
Hi, I don't know which country, sorry, I missed the question where it's coming from. But I know in South Africa, there are lots of projections for agriculture. But because we have so many biomes, they're really biome specific. And in the Western Cape, we've actually just joined up with a really exciting project that's installing weather stations across the province, and they're going to be producing agricultural models at a fine scale. So that's really exciting. And if it's successful, it's a model that could be replicated elsewhere.
Okay, in the interest of ending on time, I'm going to stop questions for now, unless anybody has any other burning issues that they want to bring up. And Joel, I'd like to ask you to share your screen one last time. The very last slide.
Green, yes, let me get the right one going. Pardon me. Sorry about that. I'm not prepared. Nothing like PowerPoint under pressure. There we go. All right. And then whoops. I'll get there. I'll get to the right place in a minute. There we go.
Okay, announcing our next session on February 23rd, 2022. To repeat what Joel said earlier, we are aiming to conduct these at the end of each month, at the last Wednesday of the month, at 3:30 South Africa time, 6:30 Mountain Time, US. So we are focused next on freshwater management, and we have the pleasure of having Dr. Eddie Riddell, Dr. David Lawrence, Dr. Dave Thoma with us for that session. So please do join in. If you would like to subscribe to the entire series and have not yet done so, you can send an email to climate_change@nps.gov. We will follow up this session with a link to a webinar recording and the PowerPoint slides and the chat conversation. If you have other ideas or resources for future speakers or for conversations you would like to see being had over the next several months, please let us know directly or through that email address. We are excited to make this a conversation more than a one-way communication. So thank you for joining today. Any other comments?
I just want to thank everybody for calling in and dealing with the bandwidth issues and stuff. And I especially want to thank John and Nicola for giving the kickoff presentations. Those were excellent. So again, thanks everybody for being interested and engaged in this effort.
Absolutely, really fantastic. Yes, thank you. And Gregor, yes, this is being recorded. We will share that link after. Okay.
But
all right.
if
Thank
I may
you.
say a word.
Yes.
Hi, Larry Sperling from Department of the Interior's Office of International Affairs. I just want to say what a wonderful discussion. And I hope this is the start of what will be a growing network of collaboration amongst all of us. You know, I think some of the topics we touched on, you know, not just how you conduct vulnerability assessments and prepare for adaptation within the confines of or the borders of an individual park, but touching on the relationship between parks, broader landscapes, multiple land uses, agriculture, communities, et cetera. I think that is an important topic for delving more deeply into, particularly in the context of you know, transfrontier conservation areas that cross national borders and that encompass you know, formally designated protected areas and other lands and other uses. So really look forward, really excited to have the opportunity to work with you all. Really grateful to our colleagues in South Africa and can't wait for the next one. So thank you all, and Joel and Melanie and our speakers, Nicola and John. Wonderful presentations.
Absolutely, here. All right, folks, have a wonderful evening and a wonderful day. We'll speak later.
Thanks for your long day that side.
Thank you.
Cheers,
Let's get it started.
Lovely to see you guys. Thanks again.
Absolutely.
And we will end this in 3, 2, 1.